Welcome to today's webcast, 6 areas where CFOs must deliver more value to the board. Brought to you by CFO Publishing, an Argyle company, and by our sponsor, Kyriba. I'm Chris Schmidt. I'll be your moderator. Before we get started, I'll cover a few features of the console. On the left-hand side, you'll be able to view slides and polling questions during the webcast. You'll also be able to download a PDF of today's slides by clicking on the link in the resource list icon area. We invite you to ask questions at any time during today's webcast in the Q&A area of your console. You'll also have the opportunity to earn a certificate for 1 continuing professional education credit. To be eligible, you must respond to all 3 polling questions that we will have throughout the webcast, as well as remain on the event for 50 minutes. After the webcast, if you are eligible to receive credit, you'll be able to click on an icon to download the certificate located in the certification section. Now I'd like to introduce today's featured speaker. First is Bob Stark, VP of Strategy for Kyriba. Bob has 18 years of experience in treasury technology, working for many of the best-known technology providers in the industry. In his role, Bob is responsible for global product strategy and market development and works with clients, partners, and industry influencers to ensure Kyriba is at the forefront of treasury technology. We're also joined by John Granado. John is the CFO for the Andersons, Inc. John joined the Andersons as CFO in 2012. Prior to that, he served as Principal of Finance and Operations for Global Infrastructure Partners. His experience spans diverse industries, both domestically and internationally, working for multi-billion-dollar conglomerates and industrial companies, including Tenneco, Honeywell, and Rockwell Automation, as well as private bank and private equity firms. He has extensive expertise in capital markets, treasury, risk management, financial reporting, and organizational design and restructuring. Last but certainly not least is Roxy Wen. Roxy is the CFO of Elo Touch. Roxy joined Elo Touch Solutions in 2014. She came to them with a proven 20-year track record of financial leadership experience, driving profitable business growth with broad expertise across multiple industries and geographies in both the public and private sector. She's responsible for leading all of Elo Touch's information technology, investment, treasury, finance, accounting, and sales operation functions worldwide. So welcome, everybody. Here's our agenda, what we're going to be covering today. First, I'm going to report on some findings of some research that CFO Research did with Kyriba earlier this year. Then we're going to have a panel discussion to talk about what we think about these results. Bob's going to share some information about Kyriba and their platform, and we will hopefully have some time for some audience Q&A at the end. As I said before, please feel free to submit questions anytime during today's webcast. We're now going to start our first polling question of the day. Please indicate the extent to which you agree with the following statement. My company's finance function does a superb job of anticipating and meeting all the needs of our board of directors. Choices are strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or don't know. Please take a few moments to select your answer. As a reminder, for those attendees seeking credit for today's webcast, you'll need to answer all 3 polling questions. I'll leave this up for just a few more seconds to allow the remainder of our attendees to answer. And once I shut the question down, we'll share the results before diving into our research findings. So just a few more seconds, please. And here are the results. And it looks like the answer is we agree, but not strongly, that we're giving the board what they need. And I think the lack of strength may result in people signing up to hear more about what we have to say today. So let's move on to the research. Once again, my name is Chris Schmidt. I run the research arm of CFO Publishing. Late last year, Kariba asked CFO Research to survey our membership on some critical issues related to the CFO's relationship with the board of directors. I'm joining our webcast today to share a few highlights from that research. We surveyed 167 senior finance executives from U.S. companies, all with annual revenues over $100 million across a broad range of industries. And just as a quick note, as if I flash by too quickly here, don't forget that you can download the slides from the console later. These are the top areas where survey respondents say that it is important for boards to receive critical information and decision support data from the CFO. Most directors expect to have a close, direct working relationship with the CFO, and the areas where CFOs seek to build that relationship are shown here, led by budgeting and forecasting, strategic decision-making, cost control, cost reduction, growth strategy support, compliance and reporting, and strategic and operational risk management. The top areas where boards most often fail to receive critical information and decision support data from the CFO are shown here. The areas of shortfall are mission critical, led by fraud management and mitigation. Rounding out the top 6 are performance risk management, strategic and operational risk management, growth strategy support, controlling and reducing costs, and strategic decision making. It's not shown on this slide, but 94% of the senior finance executives surveyed say CFOs are perceived by their boards as critical strategic business partners. Survey respondents say that the most important areas where a strategic CFO can deliver value to the board are managing business continuity, managing financial risk to prevent loss, reducing costs and improving margins, helping unlock working capital, and ensuring regulatory compliance. The survey asked about the most common factors that prevent CFOs from being a better business partner with the board and the CEO. I'm sure the list shown here is not really surprising to many members of our audience. It's organization structure, corporate culture, lack of the CFO's time, and communications issues. We asked survey respondents to name the areas of their organizations that lack the tools and technology needed to enable the board to make good decisions, to unlock value and catalyze growth. Fraud risk led the list of areas where tools and technology were lacking, followed by compliance, performance, regulatory, working capital management, and cash and liquidity management and forecasting. Lastly, we asked survey respondents which treasury management functions are most important to their board. Cash and liquidity management and forecasting led the list, followed by risk management, financial transactions, supplier and treasury payments, and supply chain finance. So now it's time for me to stop talking and for us to get a discussion going with our terrific panel. This is our first question, and we're going to ask John to answer this one first. John, which of the 6 areas where CFOs are not delivering to the board rings most true to you?
Thanks, Chris. Broadly speaking, the one thing that really strikes me before I dig down is just the breadth of what the boards are thinking we lack on the part of the CFO in giving enough information. We go from growth to cost control to strategic and operational mismanagement and management and fraud. We have to be broad today as CFOs, and that means we have to be connected to the business. So I guess for me, the one that strikes the the largest court is really strategic decision making. What direction should we go as a company? If you think about it, our boards may only meet 5 or 6 times a year, and the CFO is really ideally placed to offer a different lens than, say, the operational team to help identify strategic market shifts. Our key as a CFO is to really have credibility when offering that input. And to gain that credibility, that means we have to know our businesses really well and both the micro and macroeconomic factors that will impact our results. And then, finally, I would add the CFO really always has to be asking what is the impact on the overall business to a strategic decision versus maybe just the impact for a given business unit or division.
That makes great sense. Roxy, which of the areas that we mentioned rung most true to you?
Yeah, I think, I can agree with John more to his point that the expectation on the breadth of, perspectives and experience and involvement the board expects from the CFO today. Being a business partner, understanding the industry, customer operations, you have global supply chain, different cultural, how is that going to impact your business all matters because by the end of the day, we sit in front of the board, present numbers. We talk about data, we talk about performance, and when rubber meets the road, you have numbers, but the input of those numbers are the business. It's what happened in the industry. It's our customer dynamics in the customer with your product technology, global supply chain, also the systems and processes and what kind of talent you have in the business. That all are, all of those are input drivers of the output, performance we present in front of the board. And also add to a layer of that with your understanding of all of those variables and what the business is going to do next year, next 5 years. So I think, it's really the breadth of that expectation. And then, if we look at the 6 specific areas that board are expecting us to provide, I would say, I agree with John on the strategic decision making, but also, in the just the operational strategy and strategic and operational risk management. That is, you have to do a lot of what if scenarios and then organize and educate the organization on those what if scenario thinking framework, so that is instilled, that thinking framework is instilled in the business. That is not an easy thing to do. It's so much like a crystal ball, and you have to operationalize that.
Mm-hmm. That's a great answer. Thanks, Roxy. Bob, which of the areas that we discovered in our research rang most true to you?
Sure. I appreciate the previous answers, so I won't reiterate those, but what John and Roxy said make perfect sense. The one thing that maybe jumped out at me, actually 2 things jumped out at me. First was that there was no overwhelming response in terms of 90% of everyone surveyed said, oh, this is a problem or this is where we're missing the boat. I thought that was refreshing in the sense that it was a fairly diversified set of responses. Like the highest was fraud at just over 40%. That said, and maybe fraud is a nice segue there because that also wasn't surprising that fraud was ranked number 1. Simply because it's such a concern to boards that something happens to the organizations that they're helping oversee. I mean, the CEOs, CFOs, even different parts of the organization, depending whether we're talking about data or protecting payments, they all have concerns about what if, or when we all read a story in the news that suggests this happened or that happened, you think, oh, are we protected? Is that something that could happen to us? So it's very situational. But the problem is that fraud keeps happening more and more. Generally, from a finance perspective, the obvious target would be around payments, data as well for a little bit. But for the most part, in finance, we care about payments, making sure that there's no unauthorized payments, whether it's bank account instructions that get changed or whether someone gets access to the system or something internal. So for me, I don't know if the CFOs aren't really delivering that, but I think there's this overarching concern that fraud is a risk that maybe isn't perfectly being managed, because how do you perfectly manage a threat you don't totally understand? So for me, that rang the most true. It wasn't surprising at all.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Bob. It's time for us to quickly move forward to our second audience polling question. So audience at the ready, please indicate the extent to which you agree with the following statement. U.S. corporate tax reform is an important topic of interest at the senior-most levels of my company. Your choices are strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or don't know. Please take a few moments to select your answer. As a reminder, for those attendees seeking CPE credit for today's webcast, you need to answer all three polling questions, and this is the second question. I'll leave this poll up just for a few more seconds to allow the remainder of attendees to answer. And like the last time, once I shut the question down, I'll share the results. So let me just give you a few more seconds. And I think I can predict in my mind what this is going to be, but let us see what it says. And the answer is it seems to be quite strong agreement across the board that tax reform is top of mind. And the reason we did this is to tee up our next question. And this next question, we're going to be starting with Bob. And Bob, has your board actively engaged you on the topic of tax reform, or is it an issue that you raise with the board? How is this playing out in your world?
Sure. No, it's obviously a topical question in the sense that everyone sees it as pretty important in the survey. So, I mean, the CFOs that I deal with, whether here in the States or even in other regions, I was just in Hong Kong and Singapore just before the holidays, and that was a question that came up often, was what's happening, what is this really going to play out the way we think? As CFOs, even for regional CFOs for American companies, they had concerns about exactly what kind of cash and liquidity balances that they were sitting on, that they were managing for the organization would be affected. So there's a lot of talk around that, and the questions that seem to be coming really revolve a lot around how much cash can we repatriate back to the United States. That's by far the biggest question that seems to be coming from the people that I speak with and get answers from all the time. And there's an expectation that Treasury and Tax will deliver much more specific information going forward, but the concern that most CFOs that I speak with seem to indicate, which makes sense, I think, is that analysts and outside shareholders read balance sheets. They can see how much cash is on the balance sheet. That, as we all know, doesn't necessarily align perfectly with the amount of cash that can be repatriated. And obviously announcements like Apple made a couple weeks ago doesn't really help that much, in the sense that they stir up a lot of media attention with the suggestion that they're repatriating, every ounce of their $250 billion that overseas cash. But in reality, that's not really what's happening. And so it creates an expectation that's a little bit difficult to follow. So even just within the past week and a half, the questions I've been receiving are, is this normal? Is everyone concerned about this? Are other organizations being asked to come up basically with a very detailed analysis of how much cash can be brought back, what's going to happen with it, do we have the right visibility? I mean, a lot of CFOs have imperfect visibility into cash, which is the very tipping point or very starting point of that. And obviously without that visibility, without the proper cash structures, without that very extensive collaboration between Treasury and Tax to get that data to be able to answer those questions in a very justifiable way, it does make it a very, not an easy question to answer at all.
Certainly not. Roxy, can you tell us how is this conversation playing out in your world?
Yeah, so YellowTouch, we are a private equity company, so leverage, financing kind of our capital structure, which means that the company is always in the net debt position. So cash and transfer pricing, is liquidity is very near and dear to our heart, and then always on the top priority of our discussion with the board. So from a process perspective, our quarterly audit committee, we have a certain time set aside, really talk about what's around the corner. For example, this quarter we talk about the new tax reform and the impact on our business from a cash repatriation and also just the capital structure perspective. How do we leverage this? And then another example of that topic will be the new rev rec rule. Right? How is that going to impact us and from a timing and readiness point of view? Yeah, so that's kind of a higher level description.
That makes good sense. John, how is this conversation playing out in your world?
We have actually been actively engaging on tax reform with both our audit committee and finance committee for several months, initially more on the speculative side, and now obviously as the actual legislation has been passed, what does that mean for us? We did do a lot of scenario work prior, and some of it has been pretty on point, and other areas haven't been on point. Where we're really trying to focus is on what the legislation will mean from us from an operational standpoint. So maybe unlike the areas Bob and Roxy touched on, we aren't very international, but there are some things in the legislation that we believe are advantageous to us and will help us operate differently. So to get maybe a little more granular, we actually have a rail car leasing business, and the potential to fully deduct CapEx, even on used equipment purchases, that may have operational consequences for us, and those could be good things. Other areas we're really focusing on is projecting forward what type of cash taxpayer we're going to be and trying to model that. Bob and Roxy both talked about a little bit about cash and cash repatriation and liquidity, and so we're trying to project that forward. And then the one thing that actually in our business, there was part of the legislation actually we've come to find out had a unintended consequence for us in our grain business. And so we've actually been working with some of the members of Congress to try and get that modified. And so I think one thing to keep in mind is it's not over yet in terms of understanding all these consequences. And I would guess folks will be finding, unintended consequences as we move forward, either good or bad. So the story's ongoing.
Yeah, I think you are absolutely spot on. In our survey, one of the most important ways that CFOs were found to add strategic value to the board was by managing business continuity planning. This question, we'll start with Roxy. Roxy, why is business continuity planning important to your organization? And what are some best practices that our audience could learn from for being effective at this task?
Yeah, I mean, business continuity is such a vast topic. As for this discussion, I think I'm going to zoom into a specific area that we spend a lot of time on. We have global supply chain. We are in the electronics business, and our global supply chain is very long. So the supply chain disruption is a significant business disruption risk that we, actually anyone in the electronics business face, that we spend a lot of time on. There's really no one way or right way, so to speak, of doing things. I worked in different type of global supply chain electronics businesses. Every one of them is different. So we go back to really, understanding in the organization, understanding in depth the supply chain, the components of the global supply chain, actually your business model, how your business model is going to impact your supply chain. All of that is, important. We run a process called the SIOP process, sales inventory operational planning process. That is not just a supply chain process. It's really all the way start from product roadmap to your, commercial growth strategy, how you grow and, how you sell, and also obviously sales forecast accuracy and planning, and then flow that all the way into our supply chain at the supplier, contract manufacturer, and sub-level supplier level. For example, the Taiwanese, the earthquake in Taiwan yesterday, certain component factories will be impacted. How is that going to impact your supply chain? What is the second source strategy? So really, I think that's just an example that's very specific to our business. Again, goes to how do you institutionalize the knowledge of our business model and run make business process and daily operations that incorporate a business continuity and disruption consideration.
Terrific. Thanks, Roxy. John, what are your thoughts on ways that CFOs or yourself can add value by managing business continuity planning?
Well, I think obviously the finance function and in many cases the IT function are critical components of that. I think as we look at it, you have to have a robust plan because if you can't serve your customers, you suffer both reputational and financial risk and consequences. As well as without it, you don't have organizational stability, which can actually impact your workforce. So, but for us, I think we have thousands of customers, and that is the primary focus for us. Other constituencies like shareholders obviously are important. We've all heard about areas where folks haven't been able to meet their obligations. For us specifically, I'll give you a real-life example. We're in the commodity business, and we hedge commodities literally on an ongoing basis. And if we were out of the market for some reason due to lack of business continuity, we could be pretty severely impacted financially if there was a period of volatility. So it's critical for us. I think maybe to get a little more granular, from our standpoint, we really do want to identify areas of potential interruption and risk, both internal and external. Those go clearly beyond just systems. Then really we have a plan, and you need to develop a pretty detailed plan. We think you need a business leader who's fairly senior, not to do all the work, but to make sure that the critical, important functions within the businesses have their own plans. And you need somebody to look across the entire company. A couple other things to consider are, have you tested that plan? And if you haven't, you really do need to test it. Many companies do test their plans, and they actually have dry runs. I think that's critical to see if they work. And then as your factors and conditions change as a company, you need to update your plan and keep it live and real. So that's really what I have to add on the topic.
Terrific. Thanks, John. Bob, what are your thoughts on the topic of business continuity?
Sure. I think there definitely several pieces to this, but what Roxy talked about is that it's not just internalized business continuity planning, it's also supporting the business. I think that makes perfect sense. I mean, those external factors aren't necessarily controllable, but if they're not planned for, then the board is going to be unhappy and wondering, how did you not see this coming, or how did you not plan for these possible contingencies? So I think that point is very valid. I liked what John talked about around the testing. There's organizations I work with, there's actually one in particular that I thought of while he was answering the question, that they have a mandated work from home every single month. And it's not necessarily like the last Friday of the month or something that's planned. It's tomorrow's work from home day, or today is work from home day. And all of finance actually is out of the office on this day for the simple reason that they want to John's point, test to make sure. All the plans in the world, they may be wonderful, but in practice, there's always going to be hiccups. And if you don't have these smoothed out, if you don't know exactly how it's going to work and where those potential disruptions could be, then that planning really isn't going to be as effective as is expected to be. And to John's point, we're thinking of market volatility. So on the commodity side or on the FX side, if you miss a window and suddenly you're exposed to something because you were on business continuity mode, your office was unavailable because of a snowstorm or whatever it might have you, if you miss that window and suddenly have a financial impact, there are serious questions to answer. I mean, that's just not acceptable in this day and age. So for me, when it comes to best practices, I think there's a couple short things that I'll add. One is distinguishing between immediate, short-term, and then long-term disaster recovery plans. There's really 3 stages to business continuity planning. There's that initial emergency stage, which is, let's just say, the first day or two. There's a short-term window, which maybe is a couple of weeks or so, and then there's really more of a long-term window. And you don't necessarily have to enact all 3, but you need to have all 3 planned for depending on what the scenario is. If there's a scenario such as, Roxy mentioned the earthquake that just happened in Taiwan. So if you think about that, there's going to be certain situations. If one of the buildings that toppled, and which is unfortunate that happens, but one of those buildings that is no longer usable is someone's office building, well, that's going to be part of long-term disaster recovery planning in addition to the short-term and emergency situation as well. So I think that's one best practice that stands out, is it's not just about disaster recovery and getting up and running within the first couple of days. There may be long-term contingency to ensure that the operation from a finance perspective is smooth. The other thing I'd mention, it kind of ties to the fraud angle that had come up in the survey a couple of times, and that's really around security. One thing that I've seen many times is that there really is a necessity to ensure that systems have the same security in what we'll call normal production mode or everyday mode as in the business continuity scenario.
John, the survey states the number one area where boards want information from the CFO is around budgeting and forecasting. I guess my question is, what are the expectations from your board around the cash forecast? And what are some best practices for optimizing this process?
Great, Chris. So I think, they don't want to know the nitty-gritty about how we actually get a cash forecast. They're really concerned with things like, do we have ample liquidity to operate our business, make acquisitions to grow, and, that's their area of focus. So, I think without good cash forecasting, you clearly have to keep excess capacity, and that just impacts your capital structure and frankly isn't very efficient. So I think all boards want their finance functions to be very efficient. Some of the keys that help us are making sure we have a good overall planning and forecasting process to capture the higher level expectations around cash generation. That might be at a high level your annual plan. And then you really need to get a lot more granular and have, I would say, very, very good connectivity to your sales and operations to help inform the process. And so holding meetings with them or making sure that we get timely information is critical. Good technology and visibility to both your AR and AP banking information, tools such as, cash pools and FX management, can really also enhance process effectiveness, and you need to have good processes in those areas. Once you get a process in place, doesn't mean it's going to be accurate initially. So just good process needs to be refined by looking at what caused forecast variance and working to take that variability out of the system. It just won't happen overnight, but if you get it tight when you have misses, you know where to look, and that makes things really efficient. I think one thing that's really overlooked is that, connectivity to the business. We really have to, as finance folks, help them understand, why having a good cash forecasting process not only benefits the company, but also helps the business operate better. And so a forecast, is a good forecast, not just a forecast, Chris.
Terrific. Thanks very much. All right, so Bob, you're up to tell us what you think about the expectations of boards around cash forecasting. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the key to cash forecasting is certainty, and every CFO I've talked to has that same observation. Certainty means that the CFO needs treasury, especially in this case, to not only deliver a comprehensive forecast that leverages data, connects to systems, etc., but they also need accuracy. And when I say accuracy, it really means an extensive forecast variance procedure. I know it's a little bit detailed answer. I get into the weeds a bit, but it's important because you need to find the poor forecasts and make them better. But you also need to reconcile bottom-up forecasts from Treasury with top-down projections from FP&A so that simple things like free cash flow, which can come from two different directions in the organization, that it matches and can be explained in terms of the differences. I mean, the numbers will never be perfectly the same, but it is important to have a free cash flow number, especially for publicly traded organizations who offer that as part of guidance. And it needs to be something that can be confidently relied upon. If you can't rely on that number, you're going to have concern around exactly what am I pushing out there, and your estimates may be more conservative than you would ideally like, and that can potentially have consequences in terms of how you're perceived by analysts, and the board will take action on that for sure.
Terrific. Thanks, Bob. Roxy, what are your board's expectations around cash forecasting?
Yeah, so I think, John and Bob had really good points from a process, kind of expectations, and also John's point of connecting with the business is excellent. I just want to add that, as again, Elo's ownership structure with private equity, there's a strategic aspect of our cash forecast is our long-term capital structure expectations. How do we generate enough cash such that we delever ourselves and also, over time can get to a place that we can return some capital to the fund. So there's really a higher level of multi-year planning what makes sense with the company growth strategy, profitability strategy, and how can we get to a certain place to accomplish those goals. So it's a really comprehensive, balance sheet management, multi-year balance sheet management, and then to John's point, right, you implement that, institutionalize that strategy to, sales. How do you sign a contract with customer? How do you make sure we have the right, the most beneficial collection performance, the DSOs. So at Elo, we have a cash council. Really, people understand our longer term and specifically the next 4 quarters this year's objectives is connected with the management bonus incentive plan. And also at the organizational level, there's one metric everybody knows at Elo is our CCC, cash conversion cycle. So we manage that, and then people understand how they their daily activity contribute to the CCC performance. On the front end of the business, the collections and DSOs. On the back end of the business, the inventory and payable performance. So everybody has something to do with cash. So that culture is also important to make that strategy operationalized.
Terrific. Thank you, Roxy. Let's move on to our next question. Fraud monitoring and mitigation was the number one area where CFOs aren't giving boards everything they need. And we'll start with Bob on this one. Bob, what are the expectations from boards around fraud prevention, and what are some best practices for dealing with this issue?
Sure. Well, I almost have a tongue-in-cheek answer. The expectation of the board is don't get hacked. I say that partially tongue-in-cheek, but I think we all know there's a lot of reality behind that. The expectation is you're not going to have some sort of fraud problem, whether it's internal or external, but that doesn't mean that it can't happen. And so the expectations are that you have the right components in place, that you've protected yourself to prevent fraud, but also put in place measures to detect it so that you can mitigate whatever loss is there. So for me, fraud prevention, it has 4 components. Data security, so that your financial data is protected. That's both within your systems, so whether it's ERP, treasury systems, payment systems, whatever it may be, that you actually have the right procedures in place, typically aligned with information security, what the CISO is saying around how it's encrypted and things like that, both at rest and in transit, all those details. But that's a key point, making sure that financial data is kept secure. Second part is application security, just making sure you're not doing dumb things like using user ID and password only for your users within finance to be able to access systems. I mean, those can be, any password can be guessed, so you have to use other measures. It's pretty obvious. I'd say workflow controls would be the third one, separation of duties, segregation of process, those sorts of things. And then finally, the fourth component being real-time detection and monitoring. That's huge, and that applies to everything as simple as payments and managing bank accounts as it does to ensuring that suppliers have secure access to your portals that you provide to them from a supply chain standpoint.
Terrific. Thanks, Bob. Roxy, what are expectations from your board about fraud prevention and mitigation?
Yeah, I think Bob is right? And don't get hacked and don't get in trouble. In addition to that, we're in the POS business. So a lot of our customers are in retail. We provide POS systems for our customers, and be it in a cash registry or the full POS system, or sometimes it's even on the signage and in-store e-commerce part of the business. So understanding of POS, the higher level of fraud and risk of that particular customer industry, and our things like PCI compliance and other things are important to us as well. So that the scope is a little bit beyond just the yellow premise, so to speak.
Excellent, thank you. Don, what are your thoughts? Does your board not want to be famous in this area?
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. I think Bob and Roxy covered it in a lot of depth. Boards clearly, don't want to have large fraud. Ours doesn't want to have any fraud. But I think in today's market, as a CFO, I probably get at least 10 to 15, call it wire-based phishing emails a week that actually get through our systems, and there's thousands more that are stopped. So it's a problem that's going to continue to evolve. I think part of our jobs as CFOs is to educate the board on what we're doing. Lots of touch points. Bob talked about authentication. I think there's things like positive payee, obviously good IT security. A couple areas I think that also may help prevent our good master data governance process, ensuring that your third-party information is accurate so that when you go to check things, that you have the right information. Another area is a lot of education. So are you educating your employees as to what a phishing attack might look like? And that I think is something that's critical. And then again, really, Bob talked about this, good detect controls and tools, such as strong IT security. We actually have invested in things like automated bank account reconciliation. We've changed some processes around in terms of account reconciliations and other processes to move them up earlier in the month, so that if unfortunately there is an event, we find it faster. So those are kind of some of my thoughts on that.
Terrific. Thanks so much, John. It's time for our third and final audience polling question. Everyone can take a breather for a second, except the audience. The audience, I need you to please indicate the extent to which you agree with the following statement. Technology is seen as a critical enabler of strong strategic decision-making at my company. Your choices are strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or don't know. Again, please take just a few moments to select your answer. As a reminder for those attendees seeking CPE credit for today's webcast, you'll need to answer all 3 polling questions. And this is the last one. I'll leave this poll up just for a few more seconds to allow the remainder of our audience to answer. Once I shut the question down, I'll share the results, and then we'll ask our last question of our panelists and move on to other things. Let's see what our answer says. I think the answer is we have strong agreement that technology is a critical enabler of strong decision making, which of course, coincidentally, tees up our final question. We're going to start with Roxy here. Roxy, according to the survey, 94% of CFOs are seeking better ways to support decision making, including technology. What is your view on technology as a business enabler? And should the CFO be more involved in helping define the financial technology stack?
Definitely. I think finance and business enabling technology are, kind of in the pot. It has to be together. Again, we, are responsible for the output of the business input, i.e. the numbers and the results. The systems and the processes, the business has are really the conduit to manage the input, going through that process and systems to become your output, right? So it's definitely a very important part of our jobs, having the right understanding and capability and also talent level in the organization with, technology stack is, I think it's very key in the modern finance organization, even though, in most companies, finance and IT are 2 separate functions, but I think it's a hand in hand, and even from a control perspective, you can't just, today's world, you can't just internal control, you cannot have a good internal control environment without good technology and system support, infrastructure support. So, a little bit about us, this is I say, a ever-evolving area that every year there will be new things coming out. But really from the front end of, pipeline generation, customer service, customer relationship management, dashboarding on, demand forecasting, sales forecasting, therefore running the SIOP process, going into demand planning, and then at the execution level to ERPs, and then you go from ERP to our financial core systems of, consolidation planning and, dashboarding and analytical. I think those things are a full supply chain of financial technology, again, input, process, and output. So I think it's an ultra important part of our role in today's world.
Thank you, Roxy. I agree. John, what are your thoughts about technology as a business enabler?
I think it's critical. In our company, IT actually reports up through the finance or the CFO organization. It's critical to help drive fast, analytically based decision making, which is just essential to compete today. It also is critical to gain and retain customers. Without the right technology and interfaces, you risk not retaining your customers. It isn't just about the quantity of data. It's really about the quality and the usability of the data. And so having an understanding of what data is usable and actionable, I think finance has a unique perspective on that, along with operations. Ultimately, what I think is important is how the CFO is uniquely positioned to look at various systems and tools and how they work together. There's been a little bit of a shift, with cloud-based, best-of-breed solutions and a lot more focus on connectivity integration. And so the CFO really needs to be attenuated to that, so we can help think about what are the best economically viable options, be kind of beyond, say, what might be one of the, the more traditional one-stop ERP. Maybe taking it down to the board level, and I actually spoke to a couple of our board members about this. The board, because they don't necessarily know all the nitty-gritty of our business, they, as we look at adding technology, really do want to understand what is the value add and what is the ROI, and we as CFOs need to make that connection for them and ultimately help them in better decision making, and that's critical. I think as boards look to their CFO to play a role. And then finally, I think there is, a more traditional function here for the CFO in this area and the finance function. Technology is not inexpensive, and it's changing rapidly. So it's not just about, hey, what does it cost me to implement this, but it's really about the total cost of ownership, which includes support. And so we as CFOs need to make sure we're looking at those decisions both from a business enablement standpoint, but an economically satisfactory standpoint. And I think having that awareness is critical. And that means in some cases we don't need every solution to have 5 out of 5 functionality. For certain parts of our business, for example, we don't need that. We need a 3 on a scale of 5, and that's the best functionality versus cost trade-off. So, but I think those are areas we tend to focus on in that area.
Terrific. Thanks, John. Bob, what are your thoughts on technology as a business enabler? And I also know that you have a couple of slides you want to show us when you're done answering this question, so let me know when you'd like to move on to those.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And I really do like the points that Roxy and John made. Those are excellent. I'll actually answer very quickly just on the heels of what John said, because I think it was an excellent point around making the right choice about technology and not necessarily just spending to get every single feature that you need. So even though I come from technology, I think, yes, technology is an enabler, but to John's point, it has to be the right technology and it has to be thought about in the context of what can I do better than I'm doing today. Technology just to automate what you do today, it doesn't have the right value. And I believe John's point immensely is that you need to understand the value that it's bringing in order to determine if an investment even is made. Sometimes older technology is good enough for what needs to be done because there's not value in improving that. At the same time, you may find that something that you weren't thinking was going to do much for you actually has immense value it can provide. Not through things like productivity, which I don't really value very much, and I don't think most CFOs really do in terms of the real value strategically that technology can provide. When we're talking about business enablement, we're talking about doing new things that you couldn't do before. I guess that's a segue, Chris, to next slide, which I don't want to spend much time on this about Kyriba. Obviously, we believe in these things. We are focused on financial technology CFOs, and the reason why is because everything that we talked about today, even that entire survey, we embrace those values within our technology platform. So in terms of who we are, this is a quick snapshot of who we are, but the next slide gives some depth in terms of what we cover, which is pretty much the same things we're talking about today. Business continuity is hugely part of a platform. It needs to be part of every financial platform, not just treasury risk and payments, which is the focus point of what we offer to the market. So you can see those themes in terms of payments, in terms of risk management, in terms of control and compliance. That embraces what we offer as a platform. So I do appreciate the opportunity to say 2 quick words about that. And as we support organizations like Roxy's and John's teams on the Treasury side, we like to think that we can continue to help from that strategic CFO perspective.
Terrific. Thanks, Bob. I think we've got time for maybe one quick question, and we've got a good one here. I'll ask it to both Roxy and John. We got a question of that basically says, okay, your survey tells us what the board is asking for now. The question is what will the board be asking for in a couple years from now? What should I be ready to deliver? I think if we can start with Roxy. Roxy, do you have any thoughts about how the CFO is going to be interacting with the board in the future?
It's a really good question. Not sure I have a very good answer for that, but let's take a try. I think, with the high emphasis on technology and then the changing landscape of, a lot of automation and things to that nature, I say, higher level of visibility and what if scenarios are going to be a increasing level of expectation from the board. And the competitive landscape is changing in every industry. The new economy is really replacing the old economy, right? Look at what's happening with a used to be very well-run company like GE. Today is going through a lot of struggle. It has some internal, struggles, but in the meantime, I think the industry landscape they are in, the industry they're in, the portfolio exposure they have, it's adding additional layer of challenges to company in the, so to speak, the old economy. So I think, from a board level, the strategic level, involvement with data and analytical support, on the vision, on the industry and the landscape, I think I can see that can be a higher level of expectation.
Terrific, thanks. John, we'll give you our last word today. Any thoughts on what the interactions with your board will look in the future?
I think they're going to want everything they want today, and I agree with Roxy. I think it's going to continue to move more towards a strategic conversation with the CFO, things about, as Roxy said, how our markets are moving, how we should adapt, and really also some internal things. So as your organizations and markets evolve, how do you align yourself to be competitive? And I think those are areas that will just grow in conversation. And then the last thing I'd add is more data, as we've talked about, is going to come our way. So how do we, as CFOs, package that data and condense it down to the most important things? So it's going to be really strategic, but also tactical in getting the right information to the board to make decisions, and that's going to require some filtering, I think, given all the information we have.
That's a tricky answer. Thanks. I'm afraid we are out of time. I would like to thank Bob and John and Roxy for a terrific webcast. I learned a great deal today, and I thought they did an awesome job. I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us today for 6 areas where CFOs must deliver more value to the board. Thanks for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.